Good morning from Osaka, Japan, and welcome to episode 43 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm currently suffering from a crippling Elden Ring addiction, and I'm doing a little bit of a withdrawal this weekend. So I'm catching up on some blog work and putting out my newsletter this week. So also with that comes the audio accompaniment, this podcast. So today I'll be talking about my newsletter where I go over the conjunction sorega, and I'll be talking about Murakami Fest, which is currently happening over on the How to Japanese website. And then I'll clean up a couple details that I said that I'd talk about in the last podcast that I did not mention at the very end. So stick around for that. But before that, I want to tell you a story about my calculus teacher in high school, Dr. Collins. I promise this is going somewhere, so stick with it. So Dr. Collins was one of the best teachers I had. She's probably the reason I got into college. She wrote my recommendation letter, and she had this aura, of being very strict. She was really kind of known as a very strict teacher. And my first encounter with her was when I was in middle school. It's probably like in 7th grade or maybe 6th grade. But some of the older middle schoolers, or maybe even the younger high schoolers, had modded Quake, so that they had modded out the blood. I think the teachers required them to do that, but they were playing Quake on school computers, and they had modded it so that it was shooting like tennis balls or something like that, and there was no blood. And so we were all just kind of playing Quake and yelling in the computer lab, which was down the hall from her office. And she came in, and I don't think she even had to like yell anything. She just stood in the doorway, and all the older students just kind of like quieted, and then she said a few words about how we were being entirely too noisy and needed to stop immediately. And that really like set the tone for my experience with Dr. Collins. But I had her for AP Calculus my junior and senior year, and she was great. She really prepared us well for the test. I was not a great math student. I was very good at AP Calculus in that class, but I was not one of those people who had the kind of mathematical horsepower to take what we were learning and then apply it to other things. I haven't been somebody who was able to kind of do that and also like program and learn programming languages like that. But I think spoken languages, obviously people compare them all the time, but I think spoken languages are slightly different. It's a little bit easier to see the application and input acquisition and how you're going to go use it and what you need to do to acquire it, I think, than coding. But so I wasn't able to do that, but I was good at doing the kind of calisthenics that she set up for us, the kind of exercises. And she had a system that she had really developed over like decades of preparing students for AP Calculus. And by the end, we were doing some really complex stuff that I have no recollection of now. It's just been totally replaced by useless knowledge and interesting facts about Japan and Japanese and Murakami, obviously. But at the time, I was able to keep up pretty well, I think. And there was just one point, I think, in my senior year when there was a test. I don't even remember what the subject was, but everyone did terribly on it. And that normally didn't happen. Normally, it was a pretty normal range of grades, I think, and everybody mostly did fine for the most part. But for whatever reason, like almost everyone had like 70, like 75, something like that season below, except for me. I ended up getting like a 95 or something like that. And I just remember that she had really telegraphed what was going to be on that test. You could tell by the when she was teaching it, and like I had made almost like notes of it, like, okay, check this, and I had gone over my notes really extensively the night before the test, and so I passed like relatively easily. And I think that kind of surprised her, being the only one, because and I ended up doing some kind of like state math competition, where they shipped us up to Baton Rouge on a bus early in the morning, and you kind of answer all these math questions. And I did the Spanish test for that contest, whatever state contest that was, because that was probably my strongest subject, I think. But I think she, because of that test and maybe just in general, was like, let me give this guy a shot, rather than, I think, probably one of my other classmates who've gone on to do scientific research involving math, uh, would have been the pick there. And I don't think I did great, but it was interesting, an interesting experience. But that test has really stuck out for me years and years later because of the way that she telegraphed the content of that test. And I think that that's something that language teachers do too. And that's what I wrote a little bit about this month. The fact that, not necessarily for a test, but language teachers, when they're teaching you obviously the content of the language. So they're teaching you kanji, they're teaching you grammatical patterns and structures, but they're also telling you things about how to use that. And they're telling you things about your Japanese in particular. And often those things aren't as explicitly stated. They're often these implicit kind of telegraphed messages. And it's incumbent upon you to have an awareness of those messages, to be aware of, okay, what are they saying with this? Okay, the teachers decided to go over this aspect again, or the teacher's repeating this to me. What does that mean about something that I've said or I've done, or what do I need to be doing differently? So if you can be attuned to messages like that, I think that's going to improve your chances in a class. And it's not just teachers too. I think it's your friends and family. If they're repeating certain phrases, maybe it's that you aren't using those phrases correctly and they're trying to model them for you, or and they don't want to call you out or something like that. But they will model it for you, and sometimes they'll do that very kind of explicitly, implicitly. So the one example that I mentioned is yo desu. So that's when you attach yo desu onto the end of a regular sentence. And the example I used in the newsletter is 随分楽しんだようですね. And that's a phrase that I remember my teacher at Waseda using. There was one of my classmates I think it must have been after a holiday or something, and his family had come to visit. And he was telling us all about what they had done, what they had gone around Japan to see. And then the teacher, in quick succession, used a bunch of yo desu sentences. 随分楽しんだようですね. So it sounds like your family had a lot of fun. And, I think probably at the time, we probably could have thought, you don't need the yo desu. You could have just said 随分楽しんだんですね. And that would have said, oh, your family had a lot of fun. But that yo desu is so effective at kind of distancing the speaker from the action of the other participant in that sentence, which is the family, the people. None of the subjects are mentioned in this. The I isn't mentioned in this, right? That yo desu is basically a code word for this is my subjective interpretation of what happened. And then the tanoshinda, right, is the action the family is doing. But neither of those people, those participants, are explicitly mentioned in this sentence that I've created. 随分楽しんだようですね. And I think it's just a great example of why Japanese is so efficient and but also maybe difficult for new students to comprehend until they've kind of really abandoned subjects in general and explicit actors and sentences in a way that maybe English requires. And so the teacher really the way she said yo desu was really kind of putting a lot of emphasis on it. And I remember it just like was this message it felt like a message at that time. I was like, okay, this must be a phrase that we're not using enough. And it made a kind of like internal note, okay, see if there are opportunities to use this phrase. And I've come to think of it almost as the way that Japanese uses subjects. It's just a very nice signal that, okay, this is the person doing this is not the speaker, this action, and this is the speaker's interpretation of what's happening. So you could say, something, you can use yodes on anything if it's your perception of something. If something looks or sounds or seems a certain way, you just add it onto the end of it, and then it becomes your perception. But it also works well, especially with like gerund phrases like "yorokonderu you desu ne." And so if somebody seems to be doing something, you can add that onto the end and say and put yourself in there, and it's a very nice, clean, clear way of expressing yourself in Japanese. But the phrase that I talk about more in greater depth this month is "sorega," and that's a phrase that I felt like my teacher at IUC was sending our class a message when we went over this, and it's effectively a conjunction. And although we learned it during the Taigu Hyogen section of the course, which is kind of like not exactly the Keigo section, but it's the kind of polite interaction, polite expressions is probably the best way to translate that into natural English. And so we did an extensive section on, just making requests of people, interacting with people, and things like that. And this was one of the phrases there. And the teacher really kind of, I don't even remember exactly what he said, but it was this very, I remember, I felt like I was receiving this message. You're not using this phrase enough. You should be using it because it's extremely effective in certain circumstances. And this "sorega" it serves as a conjunction. It's a way to and it's also a way to respond to somebody that will telegraph what you're trying to say. So, say for example, somebody's called you and they wanted to confirm some information. And the example is I use in the newsletter is about a train arrival. So somebody's arriving on a train, and somebody else who might be there, we're waiting for them, wants to confirm what time they're arriving. So they would say, 10時 chaku da yo ne. So 10時 chaku da yo ne. You get in at 10, right? 10時 chaku da yo ne. And the person responding, right? So this person who's just asked this question, this confirmation that has this expectation that they're arriving at 10 o'clock. And so the person being spoken to would say, それが電車が遅れちゃって乗り換え間に合わなかった。それが電車が遅れちゃって乗り換え間に合わなかったんだ. Something like that. You could even that nda on the end, I think, would be really effective. But that それが and then the slight pause and the tone with that それが, I don't know if I'm hitting it quite right, but you'll start to hear this. I guarantee once after you've listened to this podcast, you're going to turn on a J-drama or something, or you're going to be in a conversation with somebody and you're going to hear this conjunction because that's just kind of the way things work. それが, that right there, it's what it is it's setting up the person you're talking to understand that whatever their expectation was is probably not the case. And I found a great definition on Weblio, which for whatever reason, it marks it as like Osaka Ben, which I don't think is exactly the case because you hear it everywhere. And it's got an example in Osaka Ben, but it also has just a very clean definition, which is 前の事柄に対して予想や期待とは逆の内容を述べ始めようとするときに、満ちいる. I think that's 満ちいる. That's the verb for しようのよう. So 持ちいる? 満ちいる? 持ちいる? One of those two. But I'll read that definition one more time. 前の事柄に対して予想や期待とは逆の内容を述べ始めようとするときに用いる. And so basically that is saying when you're starting to, this is a phrase used when you're starting to say something that goes against the expectation or the anticipation of something that came previously. So in this case, that expectation was that you're arriving at 10 o'clock. You're going to be arriving on time. And this person says, それが, and that's kind of going against this expectation. The train is late and I won't make the connection. So I'm unfortunately going against that expectation. And so when I learned this phrase, it was very negative. It was it's very useful in these situations where you have to disappoint someone, unfortunately. So like the way that the teacher always was introducing it was that if you're catching up with a professor or something like that who might have great expectations of you having gone on to do something, or if you were working on a dissertation or some kind of project and they, oh, how's that project going? And you go, oh, それが,予定通り卒業できなかったんです or something like that. I wasn't able to graduate on time, or 予定通り資料が手に入れなかったんです. I wasn't able to get the materials according to schedule or something like that. But that それが is a very clear signal and kind of almost sets up the person to understand that something disappointing is going to come next. Really useful in the right situation to be very clear about how you're communicating, rather than kind of trying to create a roundabout way to say something that would probably end up being a kind of chokuyaku of English or your native language somehow. Use this Japanese instead, I would say. And, I recently have been trying desperately to get back into my J-drama habit. And really the only thing I've been able to watch is Tante Night Scoop, just kind of consistently. Probably because I have this crippling Elden Ring and Street Fighter 6 addiction, which I'm doing a little bit of withdrawal this weekend because I think no Elden Ring this weekend. I'm still kind of basking in the glow of having finally defeated the fire giant. And so I just kind of want to sit with that for a little while because that took me freaking forever. But yeah, I think I need to put a little bit more time into J-drama, because when I did, I turned on some drama in the middle of the season just to kind of have something to watch during dinner, and immediately ran into this grammar pattern. There was, I don't remember what the show was, but the situation was the summer vacation was coming to an end, and a parent was asking their kid if they had finished all their summer homework, and the parent had this expectation that they had not finished all their homework, that they were kind of rushing to do it on the last day. And the student, however, responded, それが全部終わりました。それが全部終わりました。So about that, I finished it all. And so it was used positively. So I think it's not necessarily a negative phrase. It's very useful to kind of be used as something to disappoint someone, but you can use it to surprise someone positively as well, as long as it's kind of going, you're subverting that expectation, that anticipation. And I think the English that I like to think of as a kind of expedient for this Japanese phrase is about that, because about that has that very similar kind of slight pause right after. You say about that has a slight pause right after it. It's got a very specific tone to it. And everyone knows what about that means, right? You're about to say something that's disappointing about that, right? Like you're setting someone up to be disappointed, or you're not setting someone up to be disappointed. You're setting up your communication. You're setting up someone to understand that there may be some disappointment in their expectation, or their expectation, their anticipation may be subverted. And so I think thinking of it that way, it's extremely useful. And I mean, that's really the content of the newsletter. It's this phrase that it's funny, like I've been studying Japanese for decades, and I don't remember if I had ever learned this phrase like explicitly. There really is just so much to learn, and it's constant, which is I think why I'm still doing it after all these years. But just awesome, really great little phrase. Keep an ear and an eye out for it. And also stay attuned to those messages that people are sending you. I really think that's one of the hardest parts of learning a language, is trying to pick up on these things that people are trying to tell you about your language in particular and what you could be doing differently. Um, and uh, if you can do that, I think that's going to make you a lot more successful as a student and as a language learner. So, and now I'll just wrap up a couple things. Obviously Murakami Fest is going on right now over at the How to Japanese website. This is something I've done for the last, this is I think the 16th year I've done it. Just, it started off as a kind of, let me translate a little passage from something of Murakami that hasn't been translated yet. And I do it in September because the Nobel Prize is announced in October. And back 15, 16 years ago, I wasn't as jaded a Murakami fan, and was kind of always pumped for that announcement. But now I think I realize that it's never going to happen because he's a terrible writer, a terrible fiction writer, unfortunately. But I still like to do it just because, I'm consistent if I'm nothing if not consistent. And consistency, I think, really also is important for language learning. And so I just kind of keep doing it. And for a long time, it was the Hardball Wonderland project when I was doing the close read of that. And I've kind of gone in and out of different little projects, but the last couple of years, I have done a lot of looking at his travel memoir, Toi Taiko, Distant Drumming. One of those two probably would be a good translation. It hasn't been translated. It's really a great book. It's really enormous, very casual, but also very like nicely penned, very understated in a way that Murakami's current fiction is not. And right now, in the section of the book I'm in, he has just gone back to Japan in early 1987, in the summer of 1987, to look at the galleys of Norwegian wood. And he's got, when he was traveling, he was writing Norwegian wood in Europe. And so you get some of that commentary along with his experiences in Europe. And it's really a phenomenal read. I can't recommend it highly enough to anyone interested in learning Japanese, but also in Murakami, but also just in learning Japanese, right? Like if you're interested in Murakami, you're going to like this book. But if you just are looking for something kind of a light, casual read, it's a great reading practice, I would say. So yeah, take a look at those. Right now, I think the latest post, he just went back to Japan, and he's spending a little while in Helsinki before then going back to Rome, and then I think on to Greece. But I think I've got one more week of that, and then that'll wrap up Murakami Fest for this year, the 16th year, which is crazy to think about, that I've been doing it basically since I started the blog. And then the one thing that I forgot to mention, that I said I would mention in the last podcast, was the translation of the new Ghibli movie, the Kimitachi wa dou ikiru ka, how do you all live, which the translation of the English title is, or the English title is The Boy and the Heron, which when I initially heard it, there was a bit of an uproar on Twitter, and I wasn't really paying attention to the content of it, but I thought, that seems like a fine translation. I guess, I'm okay with them adapting it that way. And I think others were maybe not so keen on it. And now that I've seen the movie, I just think it's not a great title. I think you could have gone with almost anything other than that, because, I mean, this really isn't a major spoiler, but the heron doesn't really have much to do with the movie overall. It doesn't really tell you anything, I think, about the movie. It doesn't even kind of, I think you could have gone with almost anything other than that title, and it would have been a better title. Even How Do You All Live, which I think personally is not a great title. So yeah, I wanted to mention that because I said I would, and I didn't. And then I also wanted to mention, there's a Twitter account that I've been following. It's That Yuta. So THATYUTA, That Yuta. It's Yuta Aoki. I guess he's a YouTuber. I don't really know. But he does seem to have some kind of Japanese language study product that he's selling. So I'll give that kind of heads up. But he's been involved in a couple different like discourses on Twitter, I'd say. One was kind of about Japanese people and taking home their trash and not throwing the trash away, which got him a little bit of heat, I would say, from the commentariat. But another one that was interesting that also I think probably got him some heat was about Anki. He's got a very long post about Anki, which I guess I'll link to in the blog post, but I'll read a little bit here. Let me see. What's the best part to say? So he starts off, I usually don't recommend using Anki extensively to memorize a large number of Japanese words. When I say this, some people almost seem to be offended. So let me explain. He says, I'm not saying no one should use Anki in any situation. It can be used effectively in some situations. But that like one of the common ways of using it is to add definition of words along with a couple example sentences. That and he says he definitely doesn't recommend just definitions. You need to at least add example sentences, which I would say I mostly agree with. He says, I don't recommend using it extensively because I believe a more holistic approach is generally better, which I totally agree with. Then he goes on, people tend to take a pretty compartmentalized approach to learning Japanese, learning grammatical concepts in isolation, vocabulary in isolation, kanji in isolation. And then kind of there's this expectation that maybe someday when they know enough, they'll start using native content for input. And yeah, that's me kind of adding a little bit of to his this really long tweet. He's got a paid account, so he can do these super long basic blog posts as tweets, threads as tweets. And I would say I totally agree. You've got to jump into the pool. You can't just do Anki. At the very end, he does say, also, I think the SRS works really well to memorize how to write kanji if you really have to. With spelling kanji, it's either you remember or you don't. It's pretty black and white. Spelling doesn't change depending on the context. He's got a couple other tweets. I don't think there's one long one in particular like this Anki one that I've read a good chunk of. But he had a lot of interactions about the idea that you don't need to learn how to write kanji, that even he, as a Japanese person, doesn't write kanji, can't write kanji off the top of his head for most of them, and that he doesn't need to be able to in order to read them and to understand them. And that's an important fact that I think a lot of people were quibbling with and misunderstanding. And one thing that I loved was that he really equated it to English spelling, that he has trouble spelling words like psychology, chicken, pseudoscience, and acknowledge, right? Like everyone's going to have these little words that just kind of you're not going to be able to write out, right? And like the same thing with Japanese kanji, right? Like utsu, man, that's a tough kanji, and like the idea that you need to be able to write it off the top of your head is, I think, kind of crazy, especially nowadays when we have technology that'll do that for you, right? Like, and same thing with English spelling. You've got spell check. Like, I think definitely, right? Like I had the newsletter a couple, months ago about writing kanji, and that my kind of 2-year long experiment using Anki to learn how to write kanji, which unfortunately has still fallen by the wayside. And I blame, once again, Elden Ring, Street Fighter, Tears of the Kingdom, and even Murakami for kind of throwing me off that train. But I think, one thing that was interesting was just kind of like doing it, that seeing what that process was like, and now feeling that it's gone. And it's a little bit sad that, that it's gone, but also I think I still totally agree that, it's not totally necessary, that really that the most important thing is getting that holistic input, reading what you want to read, playing what games you want to play, watching what Japanese TV you want to watch, right? Like if Anki is this supplementary activity for you, that's fine, I think. But spending 2 hours a day on Anki, maybe that was a little much when I was at the height of my Anki practice. And I think it's equivalent to almost saying, like, what would it be like if you turned off, that you shouldn't use a spell checker on Word. You should turn off the spell checker on Word. You should have to write English without using that, right? Like, that's a bit extreme. And right, you can imagine a world in which if you had to type out kanji, there would be something that would tell you, oh, you've typed this kanji wrong, right? Like you haven't typed out this stroke or this the right radical for this kanji, right? Like you can imagine a world where that kind of technology might exist, but fortunately, we don't have to because uh, the technology we have is different, and we can also rely on things like grammar suggestions. That's I don't know if I've mentioned that anywhere. Is that if you one thing I do is I draft Japanese writing often in Google Docs in a Google um, doc file, and it gives you some pretty interesting grammatical suggestions. And I'm sure that it has its issues. I'm sure it's not perfect, but often it will give you some. It'll work out some of the issues with your Japanese and help clean it up a good bit. Um, and obviously, it will mark if you have a hinkan miss and things like that, and have input the wrong set of characters for a situation often. So yeah, I wanted to bring that up because I had mentioned that a couple months ago, talking about my Anki experience, and yeah, I would say for the most part I do agree with this Yuta sensei, and it's funny how much heat he got because I do think Anki is an easy way to get into studying Japanese, almost like Duolingo. It's this way you can kind of it's very tangible. That's what he said. That's a word that Yuta uses, and he says it works well psychologically for some people. I think that because it's measurable. It's something you can do every day. It's something that you can count. It's very tangible. But I'd say is that something you can do for some other more holistic project? Can you say I'm going to read 2 pages a day of a novel? Can you say I'm going to play 30 minutes of a game in Japanese? Can you say I'm going to read one chapter of a manga? Or a whole manga book? Whatever you are, whatever's going to work in your current study for that input, and that I think is critical. I think that really is critical. But the one thing that he didn't talk about that I would be very curious to know about would be active versus passive study. That's one thing that maybe I'll have to tweet at him and see if he has any thoughts on that. Like, is there a way to make your Japanese study a little bit less passive? Because I mean, obviously, all of these situations that I mentioned are very tangible and psychological. But the one thing that writing Japanese kanji out by hand is it's very active. You're producing the Japanese, and you're getting closer to doing the Japanese. Like, what if you said you're going to write 1 page in a journal in Japanese in kanji? In 400 character page like that. I think maybe even that is better than doing Anki for kanji. If you say every day I'm going to write one standard manuscript page, which is a 400 character sheet, blocked out, you should be able to find them at just about even a kombini. You're going to be able to find these kind of kanji workbooks, but you could probably find a nice little kind of journal style one somewhere at a stationery shop. But if you said, I'm going to write 1 page every day about what I did or something like that, in kanji and hiragana, katakana, wherever you are in your studies, like do that, half a page, whatever it is, that I wonder what that would be like. Maybe that's an experiment I can try for the next year. Although, man, it does seem like it would be hard to keep up with. Maybe that's what I'll do. I don't know. I love, obviously, I'm a little bit addicted to starting new projects. And so this is a very tempting one. So, but don't hold me to it. But I'd be very curious to know. Maybe that's the way you get it a little bit more active and still do the writing of the kanji at the same time. But yeah, that's one thing that's one thing as I was thinking through this that was very curious to me, active versus passive. That's one question that I feel like I was asking in my newsletter that wasn't quite addressed by Yuta Sensei's tweets about Anki and writing kanji. That for the most part I agreed really wholeheartedly with. I'll have to check out his YouTube content and see what that's like. But then I'll get back to you all. But that's all I've got. I think this that's all for this month. We'll see. The summer is just about over here. Things are just a little bit starting to cool down. It's still pretty toasty, but you can tell it's not far now. And I think once I get all this up, I'm gonna go and play some Baldur's Gate 3 because no more Elden Ring, but Baldur's Gate 3 is still very much okay. Hope y'all are doing well.